Welcome back to U.S. Command Intelligence. Right now, one of the most strategically important locations on Earth is moving toward a point where control, pressure, and miscalculation could collide at any moment. The Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, it looks like a narrow stretch of water between two coastlines, but in reality, it is something far more critical. It is the central artery of the global energy system. Nearly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil traded worldwide passes through this corridor. Every tanker that moves through it carries not just fuel, but economic stability for multiple continents. And when something disrupts this space, the effects are not local. They spread outward. Markets react. Supply chains tighten. Governments respond. Now imagine that same corridor under pressure, not from a single incident, but from a sequence of actions happening at the same time. Iran has already moved to assert control inside this space. Commercial vessels have been intercepted. Fast attack boats have been deployed in coordinated groups. And naval mines, one of the most disruptive tools in maritime warfare, are now part of the equation. These are not isolated actions. They are signals. Signals that the environment inside the Strait of Hormuz is no longer stable. At the same time, the United States has shifted its posture from observation to direct response. A clear order has been issued. Any Iranian boat involved in laying mines is to be engaged and destroyed immediately. This is not a warning. This is a line. And once lines like this are drawn in active operational environments, the margin for error becomes extremely small. Because now, every movement carries meaning. A fast boat approaching a shipping lane is no longer just a vessel. It becomes a potential threat. A defensive maneuver can be interpreted as an escalation. A delay in response can be seen as weakness. This is how controlled situations begin to shift. Not through a single large event, but through a series of smaller interactions that gradually increase tension. What makes this moment particularly significant is that both sides are operating in the same space, under rising pressure, with limited room to adjust. Iran is applying pressure through disruption. The United States is applying pressure through enforcement, and the space between those two approaches is getting narrower. That is where risk begins to build. Because when pressure continues to increase without a clear mechanism to release it, the system does not remain stable. It begins to react. And in environments like the Strait of Hormuz, where economic importance, military presence, and strategic signaling all intersect, even a small reaction can have consequences that extend far beyond the region. This is not just a developing story. This is a live, strategic situation where control, perception, and timing are all being tested at the same time. And once situations reach this level of complexity, outcomes are no longer determined by intention alone. They are determined by interaction. So the real question is not whether tensions are rising. That is already clear. The real question is how far this situation can move before something forces it in one direction or another. Because once that shift happens, it does not stay contained. It expands. And that is exactly why this moment matters. Let's break it down. To understand why this situation is so serious, you have to step back and look at the Strait of Hormuz not as a location but as a system. Geographically, it is narrow. In some sections, it is only a few dozen kilometers wide. But strategically, it is one of the most important passages on Earth. This is where a large portion of the world's energy supply moves every single day. Oil from countries across the Middle East flows through this corridor before reaching global markets. Tankers pass through it continuously, creating a constant stream of energy distribution that keeps economies running. But what makes Hormuz truly critical is not just the volume of oil that passes through it. It is the lack of alternatives. There are very few routes that can replace it. Pipelines exist, but they cannot carry the same capacity. Shipping routes around the region are longer, slower, and more expensive. This means that Hormuz is not just important, it is essential. If it remains open and stable, global systems function normally. If it becomes unstable, the impact is immediate. Oil markets respond within hours. Prices begin to rise, not just because supply is reduced, but because uncertainty increases. Traders do not wait for disruption to happen. They react to the possibility of disruption. Shipping companies begin to reassess risk. Some vessels slow down. Others delay entry. Insurance costs increase sharply because operating in a high-risk zone changes the entire economic calculation of moving goods through that space. Governments begin to respond as well. Strategic reserves are evaluated. Diplomatic channels become more active. Military presence is increased to stabilize the situation. All of this can begin before a single major incident occurs. That is what makes Hormuz different from most other locations. It does not require full disruption to create global consequences. The perception of instability alone is enough to trigger reactions across multiple systems. Now add military activity into this environment. When naval forces operate in the Strait of Hormuz, they are not just moving through open water. They are operating in a confined space where every movement is visible, every action is monitored, and every decision carries weight. There is very little room for error. A vessel changing direction is noticed immediately. A fast-moving craft approaching a shipping lane is interpreted as a potential threat. A delay in communication can create uncertainty. This creates a high-density environment of interaction. And when multiple actors are present at the same time, each with different objectives, the complexity increases rapidly. Now consider what happens when that environment is placed under pressure. Iran's actions in the region are not just about individual incidents. They are about shaping the environment itself. By deploying fast boats, by intercepting ships, and by introducing the possibility of mines, Iran is increasing the level of uncertainty inside the Strait of Hormuz. That uncertainty changes behavior. Shipping becomes more cautious. Military forces become more alert. Decision-making becomes faster and more reactive. And when decision-making becomes reactive, the margin for error decreases. This is where the strategic importance of Hormuz becomes even more apparent. It is not just a passage for energy. It is a point where economic systems, military systems, and political systems all intersect. Any change in one of those areas immediately affects the others. If shipping is disrupted, economies are affected. If military activity increases, political tensions rise. If political tensions rise, markets react. Everything is connected. This is why even small developments in the Strait of Hormuz receive global attention, because the scale of potential impact is far greater than the size of the location itself. And this is what makes the current situation so significant. It is not just about what has already happened. It is about what could happen if pressure continues to build. Because in a system like this, once instability reaches a certain level, it becomes difficult to contain. It spreads outward, from the strait to global markets, from local actions to international consequences. And that is why Hormuz matters. Not just as a location, but as a critical point where stability is directly tied to the functioning of the global system. To understand why this moment represents a turning point, you have to look beyond the words of the order and focus on what it changes in practice. Until now, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz has operated within a space of controlled tension. Military forces were present, actions were monitored, and responses were measured. There was pressure, but there were also limits. The order issued by the United States shifts that balance. When a directive is given to engage and destroy any vessel involved in laying mines, the environment changes from observation to immediate action. This is not simply a defensive posture. It is a forward-leaning rule of engagement that reduces hesitation and shortens decision time. In practical terms, it means that naval units operating in the region are no longer waiting for confirmation of intent beyond a certain threshold. Once a vessel is identified as participating in mine-laying activity, the response becomes automatic. This creates speed in decision-making, but it also introduces risk. Because in a high-density environment like the Strait of Hormuz, identification is not always perfectly clear. Small boats move quickly. Their behavior can appear similar whether they are engaged in routine activity or something more threatening. And when response timelines are compressed, the margin for interpretation becomes smaller. This is where the situation becomes strategically sensitive. Rules of engagement are designed to manage uncertainty. They define when force can be used, how it should be applied, and under what conditions escalation is justified. By lowering the threshold for engagement, the United States is signaling that certain actions, such as mine laying, are no longer part of a gray area. They are being treated as immediate threats. This has a clear objective. Mine warfare is one of the most disruptive tools in maritime conflict. A single mine does not need to strike a vessel to be effective. Its presence alone forces ships to slow down, reroute, or avoid the area entirely. Clearing mines is time-consuming, technically complex, and resource-intensive. If mines are allowed to accumulate in the Strait of Hormuz, control of the waterway becomes uncertain. From a strategic perspective, preventing that outcome requires immediate action, not delayed response. That is the logic behind the order. But every strategic decision carries trade-offs. By moving to immediate engagement, the United States increases its ability to prevent disruption. At the same time, it increases the probability of direct confrontation, because once force is authorized at that level, interactions that might previously have remained non-lethal can escalate quickly. A fast boat approaching a sensitive area is no longer just a point of observation. It becomes a potential trigger. And in environments where multiple actors are operating simultaneously, the line between caution and escalation becomes thinner. This is not just about the use of force. It is about signaling. Orders like this communicate intent not only to military units but to the opposing side. They signal that certain actions will be met with immediate consequences, but they also signal that the situation has moved beyond routine monitoring. From Iran's perspective, this changes the calculation as well. Actions that were previously part of a pressure strategy now carry higher risk. But at the same time, stepping back from those actions may be interpreted as a loss of leverage. This creates a tension between restraint and persistence. And when both sides are operating under pressure, decisions are rarely made in isolation. They are made in response to what the other side is doing. This is how escalation cycles begin to form. One action leads to a response. That response leads to another action. And over time, the interaction itself becomes the driving force behind events. In controlled environments, these cycles can be managed. But in environments like the Strait of Hormuz, where space is limited, activity is constant, and strategic importance is extremely high, managing those cycles becomes more difficult, because the consequences of even small actions are amplified. A single engagement at sea does not remain isolated. It affects perception. It influences behavior. It changes expectations for what happens next. And once expectations shift, the environment shifts with them. This is why the order matters at a deeper level. It is not just a tactical decision. It is a structural change in how the situation is being handled. It reduces ambiguity in one sense by defining clear consequences for specific actions. But it also reduces flexibility, because it limits the range of responses available once those actions are detected. And in dynamic environments, flexibility is often what allows situations to stabilize. Without it, interactions become more direct, more immediate, and more difficult to de-escalate once they begin. That is the strategic weight of this moment. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just an area of tension. It is now an environment where rules have shifted, timelines have compressed, and the space for error has narrowed. And when those conditions come together, the system becomes more sensitive to every action that takes place within it. As the United States moves toward direct enforcement, Iran is not responding by matching that force in a traditional way. It is not deploying large fleets or attempting to dominate the strait through conventional naval strength. Instead, it is reshaping the environment through a method that relies on speed, numbers, and unpredictability. This is where swarm strategy becomes central. Iran's use of fast attack boats is not new, but the way they are being used in the current situation reflects a more refined approach. These vessels are small, highly maneuverable, and capable of operating in coordinated groups. Individually, they do not represent a major threat to a heavily armed warship, but collectively, they create a problem that is far more complex. When multiple fast boats operate together, approaching from different directions and at varying speeds, they create a situation where tracking and response become more difficult. The objective is not to overpower, but to complicate. This kind of strategy introduces uncertainty into every interaction. A single vessel can be monitored easily. A group of vessels moving in coordination forces the system to divide attention. It must determine intent, identify patterns, and respond without overcommitting to any single target. This is where pressure begins to build. Iran is not relying on decisive engagement. It is applying continuous, low-level pressure that forces the opposing side to remain in a constant state of readiness. Every movement has to be evaluated. Every approach has to be interpreted. And when this happens repeatedly, the operational environment becomes more demanding. This is not just about physical presence. It is about shaping behavior. By maintaining this kind of pressure, Iran increases the likelihood that responses become faster, more reactive, and potentially less precise. This is how asymmetric strategies operate. They do not seek direct victory. They seek to alter the conditions under which decisions are made. The seizure of commercial vessels represents a significant escalation, not just in action but in intent. When a state begins to intercept and control civilian shipping in a critical international waterway, it is no longer operating in a space of indirect pressure. It is asserting influence over the flow of global commerce. This changes the situation from tension to control. Every ship that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is part of a larger system. These vessels are not isolated entities. They are connected to global supply chains, energy markets, and economic stability. When ships are seized, the message is not limited to those vessels. It extends outward. Shipping companies begin to reassess risk. Routes are reconsidered. Timelines are adjusted. Even vessels that are not directly affected change their behavior. This is how localized actions create broader impact. Control of a waterway does not require complete dominance. It requires the ability to influence movement. And influence in this context is achieved through uncertainty. If vessels are unsure whether they can pass safely, they slow down or avoid the area. If operators believe that interception is possible, they adjust their operations. This is how pressure extends beyond direct action. At the same time, the United States is attempting to maintain open access to the strait. This creates a direct overlap of objectives. One side is introducing control through disruption. The other is enforcing stability through presence. When these two approaches operate in the same space, friction becomes unavoidable, because both sides are acting on the same system, but with different goals. A ceasefire, even when fragile, provides structure. It creates expectations. It defines limits. It allows both sides to operate within a known framework. What is happening now suggests that this framework is no longer holding. The indicators are not always dramatic. There is no single moment where the ceasefire clearly ends. Instead, it erodes gradually. Actions continue despite agreements. Responses become more direct. Communication becomes less effective. Over time, the understanding that once guided behavior begins to weaken. This is what makes the current situation particularly sensitive. When a ceasefire collapses, the environment shifts from managed tension to open uncertainty. Without a shared framework, each side begins to interpret actions independently. Intent becomes harder to assess. Reactions become more immediate. And as this continues, the likelihood of escalation increases. Not necessarily because either side intends it, but because the mechanisms that previously prevented it are no longer functioning effectively. This creates a situation where stability is no longer maintained by agreement, but by restraint. And restraint, under pressure, is difficult to sustain. Naval mines represent a unique form of pressure in maritime conflict. Unlike missiles or direct attacks, mines do not require constant action once deployed. They remain in place, creating a persistent threat that affects every movement in the area. This is what makes them strategically valuable. They shift the environment from active engagement to continuous risk. A ship moving through mined waters is not responding to a visible threat. It is responding to the possibility of a hidden one. This changes behavior immediately. Routes are altered. Speed is reduced. Operations become more cautious. And clearing those mines is not a simple process. It requires specialized equipment, time, and coordination. Even a small number of mines can create a disproportionate level of disruption. This is why their use is significant. They do not need to cause direct damage to be effective. Their presence alone changes the system. From a strategic perspective, this allows pressure to be applied without continuous engagement. From a defensive perspective, it creates a challenge that cannot be ignored or quickly resolved. This is why the response to mine deployment is so immediate and forceful. Because once mines are established, the environment becomes difficult to stabilize. The Strait of Hormuz connects regional activity to global consequences. When instability develops in this region, the effects are not delayed. They are immediate. Energy markets respond first. Oil prices begin to rise, not only because of potential supply disruption, but because uncertainty itself becomes a factor. Markets operate on expectations as much as reality. If there is a risk that supply could be affected, prices adjust accordingly. This is followed by changes in shipping behavior. Companies begin to factor in additional risk. Insurance costs increase. Operational decisions become more cautious. These adjustments affect more than just the energy sector. They influence transportation, manufacturing, and trade. As costs increase, those increases move through the system. Fuel becomes more expensive. Goods become more expensive. Economic pressure builds gradually. This is how a localized situation extends into the global system, not through a single event, but through a series of connected reactions. The United States response in the region is structured, but it is also evolving in real time. This is not a static deployment. It is an adaptive operation designed to maintain control in a changing environment. Naval forces are positioned to monitor, respond, and enforce. But their role is not limited to engagement. They are also responsible for maintaining stability in a system that is becoming increasingly complex. Mine clearing operations are one example of this. These missions are not just technical, they are strategic. Clearing mines restores confidence in the waterway. It allows shipping to continue. It signals that the system is still functional. At the same time, surveillance operations are expanding. Awareness is critical in environments like this. The more information available, the better decisions can be made. But even with advanced systems, the challenge remains. Because the environment itself is changing. The United States is not just responding to actions. It is responding to a strategy that is designed to test the limits of response. And this creates a continuous cycle of adaptation. Each development requires adjustment. Each adjustment changes the environment further. This is what makes the situation dynamic. It is not moving in a straight line. It is evolving through interaction. What we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a confrontation between two military forces. It is a collision between two fundamentally different ways of applying power. On one side, the United States operates through structured dominance. Its approach is built around control of space, precision engagement, and the ability to project force with accuracy and consistency. Every movement is calculated. Every response is designed to maintain order. And every escalation is meant to reinforce deterrence. On the other side, Iran is not trying to match that model. It is deliberately avoiding it. Instead of competing in areas where the United States has clear advantages, Iran is shaping the battlefield in a way that reduces those advantages. This is where asymmetric strategy comes into focus. Iran's actions in the Strait of Hormuz are not random. They are designed to introduce complexity into an environment that is normally controlled. By deploying fast boats in swarms, by laying mines, and by seizing commercial vessels, Iran is not attempting to win a direct military confrontation. It is attempting to disrupt the system itself. And disruption, in this context, is a powerful tool. Because modern military systems are optimized for clarity. They perform best when threats are identifiable, when targets are defined, and when engagement conditions are predictable. Iran's strategy removes that predictability. When multiple small vessels operate simultaneously, when they move quickly, and when they do not present a single clear target, the response becomes more difficult. Not because the United States lacks capability, but because the environment becomes more complicated than the system was designed to handle efficiently. This creates a situation where decision-making is constantly under pressure. Every approaching vessel must be evaluated. Every movement must be interpreted. Every response must be timed correctly. And in that process, the margin for error becomes smaller. This is where the concept of pressure becomes central. Iran is not relying on a single decisive action. It is applying continuous, layered pressure across multiple points. At sea, through fast boat swarms and mine deployment. In commerce, through the seizure of ships. And psychologically, by creating uncertainty about what will happen next. This kind of pressure does not need to succeed in every instance. It only needs to succeed often enough to create hesitation, delay, or disruption. For the United States, the challenge is different. It must maintain control while operating in an environment that is becoming increasingly unpredictable. It must respond decisively without overreacting. It must enforce stability while facing actions designed to destabilize it. This balance is difficult to maintain because every response carries risk. If the response is too limited, it may invite further escalation. If the response is too aggressive, it may accelerate the conflict. And this is where the situation becomes strategically sensitive. The interaction between these two approaches does not produce immediate outcomes. It produces gradual shifts. Each action leads to a reaction. Each reaction leads to an adjustment. And over time, the situation evolves. What makes this moment significant is that both sides are actively shaping that evolution. The United States is reinforcing its presence, increasing patrols, and signaling its willingness to engage directly if necessary. Iran is continuing to apply pressure through methods that are difficult to counter in a conventional way. Neither side is stepping back. And when both sides remain engaged, the space for miscalculation increases. This is where the real risk lies. Not in a planned escalation, but in an unintended one. A situation where a routine interception becomes a confrontation, where a defensive action is interpreted as an offensive move, where timing, communication, or perception fails. In highly controlled environments, environments, these risks are manageable. But in environments shaped by speed, complexity, and uncertainty, they become harder to contain. That is the strategic reality of what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz. It is not just a contest of strength, it is a contest of approach. One side seeking to maintain order through control, the other seeking to challenge that order through disruption. And the outcome of that contest will not be determined by a single event. It will be determined over time, through sustained interaction, continuous pressure, and the ability of each side to adapt to the conditions created by the other. At this stage, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer defined by isolated actions. It is being shaped by interaction. Each move is no longer just a move. It is a signal. Each response is not just a response. It is an interpretation of intent. This is what makes predicting the next phase difficult. There is no single path forward. Instead, there are multiple trajectories, all developing at the same time, influenced by how both sides continue to act under pressure. One possible direction is stabilization. In this scenario, both sides continue to operate, but within limits that prevent direct escalation. Naval forces remain active. Pressure continues. But actions are carefully managed to avoid crossing thresholds that would trigger a broader conflict. This kind of balance is not peaceful, but it is controlled. However, maintaining that balance requires discipline on both sides. It requires clear communication, measured responses, and a willingness to avoid actions that could be misinterpreted. In environments like the Strait of Hormuz, that level of control is difficult to sustain over time. Another possible direction is prolonged tension. In this case, the situation does not escalate into full conflict, but it also does not stabilize. Instead, it becomes a continuous cycle of pressure and response. Shipping remains at risk. Military presence remains high. Economic effects continue to spread. This kind of environment does not produce immediate outcomes. It creates ongoing strain. And that strain over time reshapes behavior. Companies adjust operations. Governments adjust policies. Military strategies evolve. The situation becomes a new normal, defined by instability rather than resolution. But there is a third possibility: escalation. Not necessarily planned, not necessarily intentional, but triggered by a sequence of events that move too quickly to control. A vessel is misidentified. A response is faster than expected. An action is interpreted differently than intended. And suddenly, the interaction changes. What was previously a controlled environment becomes a contested one. This is the most dangerous scenario, because once escalation begins, it is difficult to reverse. Each side responds not only to the original action, but to the response that follows. And within a short period of time, the situation can move beyond the point where it can be easily contained. This is why the current phase matters so much. It is not just about what has already happened. It is about how close the system is to a threshold. And in environments where multiple pressures are building at the same time, that threshold can be reached faster than expected. What is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not just another regional tension. It is a moment where global systems, military strategy, and economic stability are all intersecting in the same space. The United States has drawn a clear operational line. Iran is applying pressure through methods designed to challenge that line. And the interaction between those two approaches is shaping what happens next. This is not a static situation. It is evolving with every movement, every decision, and every response. The balance that exists right now is not guaranteed. It is being maintained moment by moment, and that makes it fragile. The question is no longer whether tensions are rising. That is already clear. The real question is whether this system can hold under the pressure being applied to it. Because if it cannot, the shift will not be gradual. It will be immediate. And once that shift happens, its impact will not stay contained within the Strait of Hormuz. It will extend outward, into global markets, into political decisions, into the broader structure of international stability. This is why this moment matters, not just for what it is, but for what it could become. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think this situation stabilizes, or are we moving closer to a point where control begins to break down? If this breakdown gave you real clarity, like, share, and subscribe. Stay sharp, stay informed. We will see you in the next one.